Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome back, everyone, to Beyond the Crime. We hope you've been tuning into our previous episodes. This is episode 3. Today we'll be giving an overview of what's called CEM, or Child Exploitation Material. I have with me Lars Madsen and Shay Addison. I'm Rob Brockman, and we are all tuning in from Queensland, Australia. Welcome, guys.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Rob. Welcome.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Good to be here. Welcome back to all the listeners.
Awesome. Now, before we get started, we wanted to say a few things about a new practitioner's course, actually, that Lars and Shay have been involved in. The course is available on schematherapytrainingonline.com. Lars, say a few things about your new forensic schematherapy course for practitioners.
Yes, this is a course we believe it's a one of a kind in the world at the moment. It's a step-by-step guide to using schematherapy with forensic clients and issues. It's called A Hero's Journey. Both Shay and I have designed it and developed it and filmed it earlier this year. And we asked ourselves when we were considering this training program, what kind of training would we have wanted when we were starting our journey into forensics and working with these kinds of issues? And we tried to tailor it in that way, in a way that was both useful, entertaining and engaging for individuals starting their journey or perhaps somewhere along in their forensic schema journey. So we've, rather than having lots of lectures around it, around these topics and areas, we've tried to really demonstrate the skills. And Shay does some excellent analysis of each of the clips, detailing what's going on, what the strategy is, what the underlying context might be that is relevant to the intervention and to the situation. We believe it's really good. It's really valuable. And the feedback that we've received from people who have gone through it has been really positive, which has been great.
Yeah, I can assert it's an awesome course. It's course 2, of course, it's the new one. And there's a course 1 up there also. So if you're a practitioner, a therapist working with these folks, head over to schematherapytrainingonline.com and check it out. We run this course runs approximately monthly. Let's get back to the topic of today. Shay.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. In our last episode, we sort of touched on child exploitation material because it had to do with the case that we were talking about, the Queensland child care case. And I guess it sort of led us into a nice segue into this as a topic, in its own right for today's podcast, which is child exploitation material, as we call it here in Queensland. And it's an ever-expanding crime and an ever-expanding area of interest and resources across the board, really. So there's a lot of research being conducted on it at the moment as well. People beavering away trying to understand this issue because it's technology-assisted child abuse. It hasn't been around forever. So, from a research point of view, people are scrambling to sort of try to help us understand the population and police resources, lots of them put into trying to kind of prevent and detect it. And as therapists, I guess, we've had to adapt to try to learn how to assess and how to intervene.
So, I'm imagining in the old days, there'd be abusers, probably going back centuries. But at some stage, it became about production of material.
Yeah, that's right. And pornography in the earlier days of this issue, when the internet really took off sort of in the early 2000s and the internet was flooded with pornography. Generally, it was I think that pornography on the internet was responsible for a lot of the technology innovations that we had.
I've seen these people say that all these innovations where the screens get bigger and that, it's all driven by porn. Now we've got these screens.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
There's no other reason why we need screens that big or something.
No, so that's right, because it made a lot of money. Back in the day, it was all people used their credit cards and all that kind of stuff. And then, as technology advances and we have streaming and we have all of this kind of stuff, this crime has morphed and developed and innovated itself along with the available technology. So sort of in order to work with it in this space as a therapist or a treatment provider, you kind of have to know a reasonable amount about how the technology itself to even understand it. Yeah. Which is tricky, right? Because in therapy world, that's typically not necessarily been something you've had to be savvy about. But you really do with this to
so you got its evolution,
understand.
right? So there's producing material. I'm imagining it going back to where the 80s or the 70s. There's people producing film or something.
Yeah, that's right. Like the typical VHS, sort of beta VHS tapes. And if you were somebody who was doing that prior to the internet, you would be considered a fairly dedicated, motivated offender, because it was difficult to do and difficult to attain.
Copy and send around the world. I mean, advent of digital technologies, these things can be reproduced instantaneously.
Yeah, there's a variety, so many different ways that children or people, but children in particular, can be exploited via technology at the click of a finger. And in fact, one of the things that we've seen a real uptick in is women abusers in this space. Most people who come into contact with the law for sexual crimes are men, but since, and particularly as I understand it with COVID coming along, a lot of in developing nations like the Philippines is a really good example, where there was this pay per abuse of women in very deprived, poverty-stricken circumstances, suddenly realising that you have a wealthy abuser living in, I don't know, Sydney or somewhere, and they would do all this facilitated over the internet, so they can pay for this woman to have the child abused and live stream it, and suddenly it's an income source for people. So you have this real uptick in mothers of children.
And driven by a market from Western countries or more developed nations.
Yep, that's right, who have money to pay for it. So it's exploitation on a grand scale in that way, and extremely difficult to police. I mean, it's one of Michael Cito, who's one of the big researchers in our space, they sort of refer to it as an epidemic. It's just the proportions of it.
And it's fascinating if you look at some of the statistics, I think from a paper that I read recently by Dave Middleton, or a chapter, where he is able to sort of document the incidences of child pornographic or child exploitation material within the court system in terms of how often it was reported or how many incidences are being investigated. And it's quite extraordinary because around 2000, 2003, there's a lull, and then suddenly there's an explosion of incidences of these kinds of offences in 2007, 2008 and 2010. And it's quite extraordinary. And that's at around the time when all these user groups were online. If you remember them, you remember LimeWire and Napster.
Tor,
Tor, all that type of thing.
Peer-to-peer sharing.
Peer-to-peer sharing, and it just exploded.
Super fast internet speeds, right? Because at some stage, if you've ever tried to download a movie or something, in the old days, you'd be sitting there for 6 days trying to download a movie or something, right? In the old Game of Thrones or something like that, but with 5G now, so this can be driving. Technology is driving the capability.
Yeah, and you don't need a big clunky VHS to watch it. You don't need a computer even. You just need a tiny little smart device that fits in your pocket. And so the cost of it and the ability to kind of use technology in order to use it to create child abuse material is just, it's so accessible and it's cheap.
It's interesting. I was just reflecting on when I first started working in a prison in Australia out here in the 1990s. From memory, there was only one individual, one prisoner in this prison that was specially set up for working with or treating sex offenders. And there was one guy who had an offence of child. It was called child pornography at that stage, and that was proper videos, VHS beta videos that were being distributed or passed around under counters here and there. And fast forward 10 years and 20 years, and the incidences of men primarily that are ending up in jail for these kinds of offences is just exploded beyond recognition.
Yeah. From a treatment point of view in our clinic, most of my new clients are all men charged with child exploitation material offences by far. Yeah.
There's an epidemic of this criminalisation, like folks who might not even get caught up in this necessarily. It's at the fingertips. It's accessible.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and having been around long enough to kind of see the advent of the internet pre and post, I guess, the population of looking at working with sexual offenders has really changed in that way. And there's actually a lot of research showing that. It's actually good research from Australia around that, where the Institute of Criminology and others like Griffith Uni, for example, have really produced fairly compelling research papers showing that they think that people who only offend online with digital methods with child exploitation material are actually perhaps a different population of people from those who commit contact offences.
Right, because as well, I guess the question becomes why, and you mentioned one motivation, like an impoverished person wanting to capitalise for producing material. Why do people produce material? This is a kind of risky element of getting caught, producing and sharing, no?
Well, I think that there are a number of reasons why people end up in producing and accessing and downloading this kind of material.
It's a different thing. So producing, right, is different from downloading. It's a different thing. So to put them all together seems, the motivation for downloading might be very different from the motivation from producing.
Yeah, yes. Definitely. I would say
why are people motivated to produce and share this stuff?
I mean, maybe before we get to that and discuss the reasons why people end up all doing that kind of thing, it's perhaps valuable to sort of talk about, this idea that I guess what we're seeing in the literature, what we're seeing in the practical, clinical world is that, we're having this new subtype of sex offender joining the criminal justice system that's very different to what would be the traditional, as we understand it, sex offender type.
So 50 years ago, we didn't have these kind of guys.
They didn't 25 years ago, 25, maybe 30 years ago even, And what we see is that the individuals who have got child exploitation material offences now, and only that, are typically less likely to have histories of physical and sexual abuse, are less likely to have severe mental illness or substance abuse problems, are less likely to have early conduct problems, criminality and general impulsivity problems. They're less likely to have problems with victim empathy. They're less likely to have direct access to children.
These are the ones accessing material.
Yeah, these are
You're making an argument that for all intents and purposes, these folks appear more normal.
Well, yeah.
By any measure.
Yeah, the research that is coming out of Australia, which is consistent, across other developed countries as well, certainly fits our clinical experience in the clinic, is that these guys tend to be people, they're like 20s, 30s. They're educated, often university educated, professional people. They tend to be Caucasian, so white guys typically, and they have specific problems with sexual regulation. And so instead of the antisociality and all those things, which, previously you get contact offenders have those elements of more sort of criminal elements, these guys don't have any criminal histories. They're actually not antisocial. They're pro-social people. They're IT people. They're accountants or engineers or, people who work hard, have families, take care of things, but they have deviancy and specific,
they're engaging with this material.
Yeah, sexual problems in regulating. And so that's what we're seeing. And I guess that's what the research is showing, sort of the characteristics of this type of sample, which is a lot of people.
What I find fascinating about this is that what we have here is men who have come to our clinic who will be in their 20s right up until their 60s, have no criminal history whatsoever, have lived essentially a pro-social life, have contributed, ostensibly looks completely functional and healthy and so on and so forth, but will have been caught up in accessing and pursuing this kind of material. And many of these individuals, when you actually sort of start working with them and try to help understand how they ended up there, it typically is around, it's sort of around two factors. I mean, Shay has a lot of experience with these guys as well. It's typically around struggling with managing their internet use and having a history of sexual compulsivity, which means they struggle with sort of managing their sexual impulses. They're highly sexually preoccupied. They use
hypersexuality.
Yeah. They use sex as a way of managing with their emotional states. Coping with problems, with feelings of loneliness, with feelings
of
boredom.
So in Schema, we call this a self-soothing mode.
Absolutely.
So this is a big red flag. If males that are engaged in self-soothing via the internet, via this kind of material, it's a red flag.
That's one pathway that they just struggle with managing their sexual behaviour, full stop. And it just kind of leaks into accessing CEM material as well.
Do you see those guys, there's a broad problem? Like they might have
it's a broad
typical interests. You might not necessarily classify them as a paedophile, for example. They're broader interests, but then they find themselves delving into this other stuff. Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes. And then we have in that group individuals who struggle with that kind of thing, but they discover or they have had a deviant sexual interest, which is a sexual interest in children or teenagers.
Right. So within that group, there's the more traditional pedophiles.
Yeah, but interestingly, a lot of these guys, if you think about the advent of the internet, might be people who have some sexual interest in teenagers or children. But if the internet wasn't around, the accessibility issue is not there. Because they're pro-social, they're not likely to act on that with real children. But because the internet is accessible and you have compulsivity problems and you have self-soothing by using poor use of the internet, it's very easy for people to go down that rabbit hole.
Like an escalation model.
Yeah. And the internet, after all, I mean, people kind of feel anonymous on it, right? I mean, they, and when men are aroused, their decision-making becomes impaired, basically. And so, yeah, well, apparently. So,
Well, yeah. It's been proved in...
It has. And so so you can have people that aren't, particularly motivated to go, right, I'm going to get on there and this is what I'm looking for. But you can see the trajectory, how it happens. And the other one, some of my clients, and this is actually quite a tragedy of the internet or technology getting ahead of regulation, where you have these men who are now sort of in their 30s, who were people when they were 12 and 13 years of age, right? So coming into puberty, boys are like, wow, the testosterone hits and they're all interested and they've got all these sexual regulation problems they're trying to deal with, which is normal for puberty in boys, right? But now you've got this thing called the internet that your mum and dad don't know anything about, because it's new and they have no knowledge of it. They don't know it's full of pornography.
No capacity to set safe boundaries.
No, there's no monitoring. There's no safe monitoring going on of their use. And these are young boys. And before you know it, of course they're curious and, they click on that and they click on that. And when you have 13-year-old boys looking out online at children that are also the same age, even though technically that's CEM, it's not deviant, right? They're just children curiously looking at other children the same age. But what can happen is that through, a period of reinforcement is that their interest, that interest becomes very, very sort of entrenched. And as they grow older, again, without any kind of intervention, it's all secret. No one knows. Mum and dad have no clue. This kind of interest stays around, and they might have been reinforcing that for 20 years before they get arrested.
Well, of course, it affects their sexual development.
That's exactly right. And so
sexual identity, sexual orientation.
Yeah, so their hebephilia kind of is very entrenched then. And by the time they get arrested, maybe at 34, you're looking at a 20-year history of that kind of interest and access, which...
You're talking about someone who would sort of speaking to the development of something like pedophilia.
Yeah, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg. It's hard to know sometimes, but certainly in the history, when you're dealing with cases, you look at it and think, wow, if that 13-year-old boy had have been perhaps around...
There were safe limits.
Yeah, if they'd been around. And I actually think there's like a 10 or 15-year period of time there where the kids, those young boys born in that time frame, were just more at risk of it because people didn't know. Parents were not informed. Parents had no idea, so they couldn't monitor them safely. And I would say I've had many clients that fit into that kind of category. And it's a tragedy, really, because by the time they get to you, you're dealing with something fairly different.
That's been entrenched for a long time. Yeah. I think also when we take a schema lens to it as well, in my experience, what I've found with guys who present with that kind of history also themselves might not have had a physically or sexually abusive childhood, but what they might have experienced is a great deal of what will be described as emotional deprivation. And it seems like in their childhood, when they have been left to their own devices without supervision to access the internet, that what they have done is that they have used, or somewhere along the line, they have learned to be able to access pornography and found pornography is a way of allowing them to cope with difficult feelings that they might have. So they learn very early on to use sex as a way of soothing.
Self-regulate.
Yeah, self-regulating. And that's what...
You're alone, bullied, whatever, but you can always go home and you have this outlet.
Yep, it provides a way of self-regulation. So the self-soother, the self-soother mode, and the core schema underneath it is this emotional deprivation, and the feeling that people talk about is this experience of feeling alone, and feeling invisible and feeling, no one is coming, no one is going to see them, no one's going to help them. And the go-to experience is, pursuing sex.
So you talk about the self-soother mode, and in the schema model as well, the other mode that comes to mind would be like an impulsive mode. We call it the model, we call it an impulsive child, but it feels like a weird way to say it in this context. But an impulsive mode, a mode where the issue is about impulse control, it's about
self-discipline,
doing what you want, self-discipline, putting limits on yourself, saying no to yourself, saying, look, it's not right, or that kind of thing. This is a boundary I don't cross.
And I think part of that, Rob, is informed by, when you have people that are, repetitive users of it on the internet, they become so desensitized to what they're looking at, and it's so prolific, and they feel anonymous because they think, well, for people that aren't the makers of it, they feel like, well, I didn't make it, I'm not paying for it, everyone's doing it.
They think it's a victimless crime or something, or I guess that's the distortion.
And that's right, and they don't really think, and a lot of the imagery is made to look as though the young people, children in the imagery are enjoying it. That's very deliberate the way it's engineered. So they're full of distortions and permission-giving statements and just really lack of information about what they're actually viewing is exploitation.
So what you're saying, though, guys, is that there's a whole cohort of males that are buggered, that they're right, that they've been, to put it a different way, that they've been exposed to that much stuff, potentially without any guidance, without any boundaries, without any limits.
Yeah, but not everybody ends up crossing the line, right? So these are men that have that vulnerability and didn't have the monitoring, because you still have people that have the vulnerability, but if they're in a system where mum and dad are on top of it, or people are aware of it, and they've got, the net nanny on or whatever, you've got ways and means of that not happening.
Like, is this a similar thing to like where some will go towards things like bestiality, or like is it just what are they accessing at this early stage? Like, is it a little bit random?
Well, I think that there are some folks who will end up becoming so preoccupied and compulsive in their internet use and their pursuit that they will sort of span all these different kinds of categories. And they typically experience that. They describe the experience where they find that they end up they're chasing the high or the hit that is just that little bit more than the last one. And obviously because they're spending, as Shay said, spending so much time looking at this stuff, they just get desensitized to it, and it doesn't give them the same dopamine kind of buzz, and they need the next one and the next one and the next one.
It's an addiction model for you.
Yeah, for a lot of these guys, it absolutely is. It absolutely is.
Preoccupation and everything. It's
But the other part of it also is like lonely child is there because, they're kind of self-soothing because of that. But when you get into these CM world, right, it's a community. And so some people who might be really deviant and antisocial kind of they find their crew in there, right?
Then do you stumble on another potential motive for production, right, which is somehow to seek approval or connection or
absolutely
aggrandizement.
Yeah, being the king, there's kind of like a rules of engagement. Hierarchy, rules of engagement on there where it's like you got to give a little to get a little. And so if you have novel material or more extreme material, or you have things that people haven't seen, it's valuable, it's currency. And in order to enter into some of these places, you have to give material in order to gain entry. And the more that you can fulfill what people are after, which is novelty and extremity and all that kind of stuff, that gives you status and the potential to kind of climb through the ranks.
Is it just about status, or do you think it's about connection as well, or community? Do they report a sort of validation of community or something?
Yeah, look, I would say people feeling like they're doing, some offenders that I've worked with have even talked about saying they felt like they were doing people a favour. That's approval seeking. So they've got this approval seeking kind of schema obviously activated.
Massive distortion.
It's gigantically distorted, but this is what they describe as having motivated them. They wanted to
almost being helpful in their own heads.
Yeah, that's right. For that. And so they feel like they're part of the crew.
Affiliation. It's group affiliation.
It is. I think one of the things that I certainly have observed with individuals who go into these chat groups and becoming ensconced in them is that they almost it becomes sort of an escape from the reality of their life. And in their life, they often have a sense of feeling quite isolated, quite different, quite perhaps defective to everybody else, and quite shunned. And they have this secret that they can't tell anyone about and they can't talk about, and they're able to connect to folks on the internet, in chat rooms which is not that hard to find at all, where they can get validation for their.
So this is the dark side of the internet. The good thing is we're all connected. The bad thing is we're all connected.
The good thing. That's true.
Anyone can make an echo chamber, and in the old days,
and then you're stuck in these groups where, in a sense, rather than being able to go and look at it in a healthy way and think, well, this is problematic, and this is separating me from being able to have those relationships with healthy adult people, consenting relationships.
You're getting validated. You're getting told.
These interests and this deviance is being reinforced because people are sharing their stories and encouraging you and supporting you, and you have this experience of feeling validated and understood and cared about, which of course is only within this microcosm of this chat room, and no one knows each other, right? No, everyone's anonymous, but it's a way of getting this kind of sense of community with people from all over the world who might have a similar view or opinion.
Yeah, I would say people who seek that element out, or, you mentioned before a difference between people who produce it versus people who might consume it. There's a very different profile of people for that. I mean, people who are the ones creating the material with the live children, that there's something very different about them versus the sort of sexually preoccupied, lonely kind of person who's self-soothes by consuming the imagery. Clearly people who are having children and filming them and posing them and forcing them to do these things and then distributing that for profit have a very different psychological
These categories
profile.
Also lie in a hierarchy in that world, like the person who's producing versus the person who is just downloading.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's the producers and the people like that the police are. I mean, the police try to detect and police everything, but that's the thing that the police really go for. Like Argos, which is the big unit here in Queensland, who are in charge of this sort of stuff, are a sort of bit of a crack unit at detecting that. And they play the long game. They'll take over the identity of someone they arrest in one of these groups, and they might assume that identity for years because they're trying to find the big fish.
The head honcho, they want to take down the whole system, yeah.
Yeah, they want the producers, and consumers are seen as little fish, but nevertheless, I mean, they get detected.
And they've been quite successful in some ways, right? Because they do these arrests where they might arrest in one day internationally, they might arrest like 1,000 people.
Yes, because it's coordinated across certain countries. Yeah, they'll execute. They will have, and that might have been a job that the police have been working on for 5 years, and then suddenly
they've got to do it instantaneously across jurisdictions because people get wind, and then they're going to go and delete things and all this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And it's still even hard for them to police these days because there's certain encrypted things that the police can't crack. And if the person doesn't cooperate and give them the passwords to things, there's just stuff that the police can't access for people who have got very sophisticated technology knowledge.
What's, now that we're talking about contact offences and producing pornography or child exploitation material and downloading and viewing it, is this idea that actually the individuals that might end up looking at this stuff, and the research suggests that if they don't have any criminal history and that they're a one-time CEM offender, they have one incident, then their risk of going on to a contact offence is actually not that high. It's not inevitable, which is a surprising thing, but perhaps not that surprising when we think about what this population actually looks like. So this is as we've said before, an educated,
tax-paying,
pro-social individual, ostensive purposes, who doesn't have any criminal history, that are getting picked up for these kinds of offences.
And who tend to be low risk of contact offences.
Yeah, the research shows that these individuals, once they are picked up, the risk of recidivism and the risk of a further contact offence or a contact offence after an internet-only offence is actually pretty low, in the single digits when you look at overall samples. Although this research is obviously just coming out over the last 10 years or so, but the research shows that those individuals reoffend at a much, much lower rate than contact offenders.
So those individuals must, I would imagine, do pretty well with something like a schema approach. It's a sort of self-soothing model. Underneath that, there's schemas like emotional deprivation, defectiveness, maybe social alienation. These are the sorts of patterns that we treat clinically anyway. People who feel disconnected, people who might be socially alienated. What's different is the kind of the behaviour they're being called out on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in my experience with the clinical guys that I've worked with using schema therapy, that schema therapy is a really good model for them because they get it very quickly and it's very, very applicable because there are some key modes that stand out, that are relevant. The detached self-soother is obviously one. The detached self-stimulator, which is the mode that often will become desensitized to whatever it is that they're looking at, and then
drives more of an excited pathway.
Yes, it drives that sort of, I want to see more. I want to see that next big hit of something. And a lonely child, typically with a very strong emotional deprivation schema that is activated. And it's when those feelings get sort of very that schema gets activated that all this stuff becomes very, very
I'm going to
powerful.
ask you something strange now because it came to my mind.
Go on, Rob.
How many guys do you get come in, honestly? Because as you said, there's a lot of them out there, and they preemptively seek out therapy. They say, hey, I'm aware this is a bit messed up. I need help with this shit. How many
accessing CEM?
Yeah, these kind of self-soothing ones, the more casual, it sounds like accessing.
Yep.
How many actually come seeking help?
Without being arrested.
Correct. That's the question.
We've had some. I would say they're in the vast minority because people, obviously we have mandatory reporting in Queensland. So it's really difficult because if people want to get help, the way you have to manage people's disclosure and the way you have to manage that is incredibly difficult because we have legal responsibilities. Yeah, but it's hard because, I mean, who knows if people felt more able to, I don't know, access.
Seek help at an earlier stage, yeah?
Yeah. But it's a little bit like I think we mentioned in one other episode where we have people with pedophilia who have never committed a crime, but they've got the problem. We also have folks like that who've come to the clinic. They seek it out, but it's not an easy thing for people to do. And I'd say they're in the tiny minority.
So it's quite a minority. I mean, almost
There is a group of people who will present for therapy because they're struggling with sexual self-regulation, and that will span internet use, but also visiting brothels and using sex workers and that type of thing as well. And sometimes, it'll be when they report or describe their accessing of the internet, then it'll be anything that is accessible because it's unrelenting.
Yeah, and you'll have a lot of men who get arrested for CEM who come in who just have sort of broad problems with sexual regulation. So there'll be people that are visiting beats, they're sneakily using sex workers behind their partners' backs, they're accessing all sorts of sexual things. They're having sexual chats, which are secretive in groups. They're accessing lots of pornography online. They've got many outlets for sexual kind of gratification, and they're very sexually preoccupied people. And depending on where they're at with things, we would often also recommend with them that medication, sending folks to get some medication to help with that, can be extremely helpful for people. And there's a percentage of folks who just really need it.
But it sounds like from what you're saying, the vast majority that present where there's been some kind of legal intervention.
Yes. Yeah. I would say 99% of people that come along because they've been arrested and the lawyer is saying, hey, you got to go and get help.
Shay, I know that you have seen quite a number of guys working with this kind of issue. What would you say when you're describing sort of the treatment approach that you have using schema therapy with these individuals? What would you say that some of the key things are for people to bear in mind or think about when they might see a client like this? Yeah,
I would say that the lonely child is definitely typically sort of at the core of the vulnerability. People feel that, sort of have avoidant coping is really the key, the hallmark to a lot of it, in the self-stimulating kind of mode. I mean, in terms of treating that, there's the schema therapy kind of techniques that you use, but there's other ways that you sort of overlay that with as well. So we would use contextual strategies. So accountability software is a big thing for helping CEM. So I don't know if for everybody, accountability software there's one's called Accountability to You and things like that you can put on devices. So you have someone at the other end who's going to get an alert if you kind of access things you shouldn't or going down that rabbit hole. Is that the kind of thing you mean, Lars?
Yeah. I'm thinking in terms of what are some of the core schemas that you've noticed in the clients that you see with this issue?
Yeah, I would say emotional deprivation is, like you mentioned before, was kind of is the big one for most people. And so that impacts a whole range of functioning that makes it difficult for people to have good, rewarding connections. And
these are people with relationships that are not satisfying in terms of your core emotional needs of things like attachment, connection, intimacy. I mean, so these are folks that would struggle with healthy intimacy.
Yes, that's right. Their reliance on these unhealthy mechanisms, is compensating for that. And they often just don't, like most people who have schemas, they don't realize they have it. They don't really understand the insidious nature of it. It kind of spawns out across all areas of their life, and they often have poor ability to even label their own feelings. They don't understand what they're feeling or to communicate their needs to other people. And there's an expectation with emotional deprivation that other people kind of won't get them, or that they can't, they don't even anticipate that other people could be there to do anything about it.
And then,
so they go it alone. And with men, unfortunately, they're just more at risk of going it alone sexually. And when you've got such easy access as the porn all over the internet, that just becomes a bit of a go-to thing for some men.
It becomes easy to access. It's cheap. It's anonymous. And also, I think what happens for guys that traps them into it is that they then feel deeply ashamed and defective because of this stuff. And that then triggers the cycle again. So it then becomes another trigger to needing to try to soothe or cope or deal with that kind of emotional experience. So you can see that almost over time, this cycle just kind of develops where they feel lonely and isolated. They've learned somewhere that actually pornography and accessing sex is a way of dealing with that stuff. They rely on it. They over-rely on it over time, and they move away from relationships. They move away from seeking contact and connection with other people. But at the same time, they desire it and want it, but don't know how to get it. And then because they're accessing this stuff and they're getting involved in this over time, they feel ashamed and defective or something similar to it. And that then becomes the trigger to kind of need to rely on this as a coping mechanism going forward.
Yeah.
Just kind of rolls downhill, doesn't it? And then in the midst of that, this is what you were saying before, right, Shay, where it just reinforces particular kind of sexual schemas and interests that then become compelling in and of themselves.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, and this is the nature of these CEM-only offenders, these kind of sample of people that aren't typical criminal kind of people, is that as bad as the criminal justice intervention feels for people, as terrible and difficult as those consequences are, in every single case, I would say there's an element of people feeling, thank God, or, there's a silver lining to it, because it's out in the open. There's a chance now to get support that they could never have asked for before. They can't tell their parents, their partner, their people around them. Now it's blown open.
There's not many clinics for these things. No.
Not really, no. And people then, it's not their kind of shameful secret to hang on to on their own, which actually just perpetuates the problem, So after they've gotten over the shock of the arrest and whatever, because people have never had any dealings with police typically, they're then able to really feel, I guess, great benefit in terms of getting treatment and in terms of being able to kind of deal with some of those more core reasons.
So the access and use of CEM in our society is an epidemic. It's being fueled by things like technology in psychology and in schema therapy and in treatment. We have good conceptualizations of these kinds of offenders. There is treatment. However, people tend not to seek it unless they get a big rap over their hands from criminal justice system, and that's an impetus for people to seek help.
Yes, that is I would say a very good summary there, Rob. Definitely.
And this is what it's all about. This is when we talk about CEM. This is what we're talking about.
And I think, just to add to that, is that schema therapy is a therapy that offers a great way of making sense of this issue for the individuals who struggle with it, and it provides not only a way of conceptualizing why they might have the problem, but also what might maintain it over time using the schema model and the modes. And I found that the clients grasp the model very, very quickly, and they understand what's going on for them, and they understand the modes, and they understand how everything kind of gets linked up for them. And that, I think, is, for many of these individuals, feels quite reassuring, because suddenly, their world feels a lot more understandable than it perhaps did previously.
Before we wrap up, and we should wrap up in a second, so the criminal justice system plays an important role in initially setting the boundary and the focus. What's the sort of, when the outcome is good, do you get good outcomes with some of these guys where they're able to get, their life back on track? I guess that's one question. But if it's a first-time offence and that, this kind of scope, how punitive is the criminal justice system?
Oh, yeah. In Queensland, it's getting more punitive. They passed laws about 2 years ago. They passed laws where if you have a conviction for child exploitation material in Queensland, it's a mandatory prison sentence. Well, the length of time is up to the judge, but it's a mandatory jail term, whereas it wasn't previously. The judge had scope to sentence for community outcomes, which is typically what people got, right? But now you can only get a community outcome if there are exceptional circumstances, and you have to prove that to the judge. Otherwise, people go to prison. So you have people, and that's a very popular kind of thing amongst the community.
You're not going to get much of a blowback.
Exactly. And nobody who works in this field obviously, condones any of this stuff, but people who work in the field and academics and whatever, nobody thinks that that's good policy.
The mandatory sentencing part.
Yeah, nobody thinks that's good policy, right?
And it's problematic on a number of fronts, because some of these individuals end up being, they become completely dysfunctional to the community in terms of having to go to jail and becoming traumatized and damaged because of that, and struggle to be able to recover and become functional members of the community. And the data with regards to the recidivism rates of these individuals shows that the majority of them, regardless of whether they have treatment or not, actually do not reoffend again. And that's something that the courts have.
So I guess you're making the argument that approach with this subset is overshooting the mark.
Well, I personally think it is. But
and
as
it's
a
not
final,
supported by the data, it's supported maybe a bit more by, by emotions and by politics and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. And I know we're going to wrap up, but one thing I wanted to say about that, which I think is really good, is that this stuff is only accessible because platforms allow it to be accessible, right? You have the dark web and all that, but this stuff is accessible on TikTok, on Instagram, on Kik, on Reddit, on things that are mainstream platforms, and they are owned by wealthy companies. And so Australia has now legislated to force platforms to actively police and remove child exploitation material. Well, first, right? So, we hold, rightly so, individuals responsible. But, platforms have a large part to play for this. I think we got some information here that Twitter was recently fined $600,000 for child exploitation compliance failures in Australia. I think it's one of the first fines handed out, and apparently they're looking to dispute that. So, these are enormous companies, that can resource and do way better. And the reality is, if the platforms that allow this on there were really vigorous in terms of their policies and their methods for removing it, tracking it and removing it,
vigorous as their marketing campaigns.
Exactly. You would have we would have far fewer people actually accessing it and being arrested for it. I think they have a massive part to play, and this is a new thing.
Correct. And when you think about the idea of removing access and opportunity, then the vast majority of people simply would never find their way there.
Yeah,
and wouldn't pursue
with
it.
This cohort, right?
Yeah. With the cohort that we talked about before that don't have a history of contact offending.
All right, you guys, that's a wrap. That's a wrap for episode 3. Shay, do you want to say something about our next episode?
So we're going to record.
We go from one intense topic to the next.
Yeah, somewhere in December, our plan is to record our next podcast on sexual sadism. So this is a particular paraphilia, very serious, not specifically common, but we certainly have, Lars and I have cases where we have worked with people who have this particular problem. So we will also look at that, deconstruct that through the lens of forensic schema therapy.
Maybe talk about some case kind of examples / extreme examples in the media.
Yeah, we can look at media cases, but I think also Lars has several case examples where you can look at how to do a bit of a
works,
specific deep sort of application of how you might do schema therapy with that in terms of the...
Just understanding it.
I actually have a chapter in a book that is being published this year, apparently. It hasn't been published yet, maybe next year, in German, unfortunately.
What's the chapter called?
God, it's
German, Rob.
It's
I'm not even going to try that.
look, I titled it "Deconstructing Sexual Murder: Schema Therapy with a Convicted Sexual Murderer" or something like that. So this was an individual that I worked with for a number of years using schema therapy and breaking that down. So
so we'll probably
look
at that in a individual kind of case way.
All right, you guys, loved hanging out with you today and just a bit of a deeper dive into this interesting topic. We'll see you guys, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you guys next month.
Yeah, tune in then. Thanks. Bye.
If you're interested in learning more about schema therapy, join us in a hero's journey, the Schema Therapy Sessions at schematherapytrainingonline.com.